All right. Welcome back. Your handouts are on the table in front of you as we resume again after a little bit of a break. And I trust your Christmas was enjoyable and that you had a little bit of a break and that you used all of your spare time during Christmas to catch up on all your Old Testament reading, right? Is that what you did? Oh, we got one honest person. He's saying no, and that's good. That's great. We're going to be in 1 Kings tonight. 1 Kings is where we resume. We have gone, believe it or not, just in the short time that we've been together, we've gone all the way from Genesis up to the end of 2 Samuel. And as we said from the very beginning, we're going to be following each of the Old Testament books as they are placed in our English Bibles. You'll see the significance of that when we get into 1st and 2nd Chronicles. You'll see the significance of why I'm saying our English Bibles. And we'll continue on working through now the historical books. We began the historical books basically when we got into Joshua, right? To talk about the history of the nation and as it develops and as it expands and as it goes into the Promised Land. Judges and Ruth give us some historical background, of course. 1st and 2nd Kings cover the kings, basically, the first two, right? Saul and David. And now as we get into First Kings, we get into some of the other areas that, when we're going through this section of the Old Testament now, we're finding ourselves in some rocky territory. There are some highlights. But by way of introduction, when we're talking about 1 Kings, we would have to say this, that the story of 1st and 2nd Kings is basically one of failure. When you put it all together, those two books basically talk about the failure of the kingdom after David and after Solomon. Because basically what happens is this, the nation passes from affluence and influence. Okay? The best years for the kingdom was during the reigns of David and Solomon. Solomon being David's son, of course, and those were the peak years for the kingdom. It's after Solomon's reign is done that the nation goes from affluence and influence to what we would call poverty and paralysis. They basically are not able to do anything after Solomon's reign. Now, it's of course during Solomon's reign that we see the downturn take place, but it's really after Solomon is passed off the scene that we really get into the issues that 1st and 2nd Kings talks about. So, the opening chapters of 1 Kings describe the glory that attended Solomon's reign. But again, by the middle of the book, we see the antagonisms that are taking place between basically two main factions within the kingdom. There's the 10 tribes to the north. We will call them Israel. And there are the 2 tribes to the south that we will call Judah. It will be this book that will introduce us to the phenomena of a divided kingdom. It's this book that begins to introduce us to the litany of lists of kings, both bad and good, that will reign both in Israel and in Judah as those separate kingdoms basically are established. But it's about halfway through this book of 1 Kings where we see the antagonism beginning between those two main factions that will bring about the eventual split that takes place. So, by revealing the failure of humanity and human governments, because that's really what we see here. That's really what we experience as we read 1 Kings. You see the failure of humanity, the fact that even though we're the intelligent beings that we are, we still can't keep it together, right? And even as we set up particular structures and systems whereby to help us survive, we find that even they will fail in time. And so that's what we will see as we go through 1st and 2nd Kings. But what also we find is that as the failure of humanity and human governments take place, what 1st and 2nd Kings also does is it points us forward to that age when God will come. Remember, we've been talking about, right from the very beginning of our Understanding the Old Testament series, we've been talking about God's redemptive plan for humanity, introduced to us right in the very first book. And along with that plan for redemption, also is the other half, we could say, of the story, if we want to put it that way, whereby God not only has a plan of redemption for his people, but also is moving forward and moving us in our human history forward to the time when God will indeed finally come and take over, and the theocracy that he had intended, right? Remember, we said in 1st and 2nd Samuel how the nation wanted a king. God wanted a theocratic system whereby he would be ruler and the king would be the representative, okay? But the people wanted a king, like all the other nations. They wanted a monarchy system, okay? God had always intended for a theocracy. Guess what? God will get his wish. God will get his desire. God will, and we're still waiting for that day, of course, when the theocracy indeed will take place, where he will be king and all others will answer to him. As we've said in our slide here, we are appointed. The 1st and 2nd Kings points us forward to that age when God will set up his own kingdom with the greater son of David. Who would be the greater son of David? That's Jesus, of course. All right, and as Jesus is the sovereign head, all the nations will be subject to him. All right? So this points us forward. So in the midst of our disappointment and the failure of what is shared here, we can't forget that God's plan continues on, regardless of our failures. God's plan continues on. So let's take a look at an outline of this book. There's 22 chapters in this book. So you could read this book in less than a month if you were to take a chapter a day. Or if you were to just take 5 days out of the week, you'd have it done in 3 weeks. Okay? So that gives you an idea of how quickly you could go through this book. But the first 2 chapters we'll talk about, as 1 Kings talks about, we talk about the death of David. This is where we come to the point where the reign of King David comes to an end. And we see in those first 2 chapters when the book deals with the death of David, how beloved King David was with this nation, and still is. You still go to the promised land today. You still go to Israel today, and you want to talk about King David? Boy, I tell you, eyes light up, smiles come across faces, even after all this time. But the first 2 chapters deal with the death of David. Then we get into the deeds of Solomon from chapters 3 through 11. This is where we begin to see what will happen in Solomon's reign. And this is where we're introduced to some of those famous instances in Solomon's reign whereby, God asks him what he wants or what he desires, and rather than asking for material goods or great power, what does Solomon ask for? He asks for wisdom, right? And God's response to Solomon is, well, since you've asked for wisdom, you will also have great power. You will also have, you will be one of the richest kings that the world has ever seen. Not only then, but even since. This is where we're introduced to that famous account where 2 women come to Solomon to settle a dispute between them as to who was actually the child of the mother. The one claimed to be the mother but wasn't. The other claimed to be the mother but was. How do you determine? There's no such thing as paternity tests back in those days. And the great wisdom of Solomon comes through. And we see how he deals with it. And that's just a couple of highlights that we see with regard to the deeds of Solomon. Perhaps the greatest deed that he does during his reign, and it's given for us in 1 Kings, is the building of the temple. Remember, David wanted to be the one to build the temple, but God says, no, that won't be for you, but that will be for your son. And so Solomon is the one that builds the temple for God. And that was one of the great deeds that Solomon did as well. There's other deeds that we are privy to as well in those chapters, but those were we would say are the highlights. It's when we get into chapter 12. In chapter 12, we would basically say this is the key chapter for the book. Okay? So if you're looking for a key chapter, chapter 12, this is where we see the division take place. Solomon is now dead, and his son Rehoboam takes over, and this is where everything falls apart. And we'll get into that a little bit later as we go on. But chapters 12 through 16 talk about the division of the kingdom, and then chapters 17 to 22. Here's where we're introduced to this prophet by the name of Elijah, and he is one that is quite famous now, as we have recorded his deeds for us in 1 Kings. Remember, he's the prophet that took on the 400 prophets of Baal, right? the fire coming down from heaven and consuming the sacrifice, not only consuming the sacrifice, but consuming the altar, consuming the water that was around the altar, right? And Queen Jezebel was just so excited about what the prophet Elijah was able to do that Elijah ran for his life. Because Jezebel made the decree that he was not going to see the next morning. Well, Elijah did. And we find in these chapters the interaction that the prophet Elijah has with King Ahab and King Jezebel. Now, by this time, we're into the divided kingdom. And we find a lot of things taking place that cause us, perhaps in our reading, if we've been going right from Genesis, and we find ourselves now in 1 Kings. 1 Kings, as we said, this is basically 1st and 2nd Kings. It's a point of failure. We see the downturn that happens. But here's where we're introduced to the prophet Elijah. So, by way of background, let's deal with this. And when we're talking about background, I have background of 1 Kings, but really we're talking about the background of both books, 1st and 2nd Kings, all right? And its title and its place in the canon, we say this. The title Kings is very appropriate for these books. Why? Because they record events in the careers of kings. We're talking about more than one king, of course, because, again, here's where we are introduced to the divided kingdom. So we're talking about the careers of the kings of Judah and Israel. Basically, these books will take us from Solomon to Zedekiah. Zedekiah being the last king. Seems kind of appropriate, doesn't it, that Zedekiah being the last king, his name starts with the last letter of our English alphabet. I don't know if that's a coincidence or what it is, but that's basically what will happen. Solomon to Zedekiah, these two books take us through their histories. And let's remind ourselves that when we go back to the early Hebrew Bibles, 1st and 2nd Kings were just one book. Okay? Just like 1st and 2nd Samuel. Same with 1st and 2nd Kings. They were just one book in the early Hebrew Bibles. But when the Septuagint translators got a hold of it, now let's remember who the Septuagint translators were. They were the ones that took the Hebrew Old Testament and translated it into the Greek language. Okay? And so as they did that, they made the two, or the one book, they divided into two. Okay? Now, basically, the reason for this was just simply out of convenience. In the early Hebrew Bibles, what was the form in which they found the text? In scrolls, right? And the way in which the scrolls were written in the Hebrew language, when we write in the English language, we have space between our words, right? And we have uppercase letters and lowercase letters to help us, right? In the Hebrew language, when they wrote the text, there was no space between the words, okay? And everything, because Hebrew is what we call a consonantal language, they're all consonants, there's no vowels. The vowel is all done through a pointing system in the text. So all of the letters are jammed together in capitals, okay? But because Hebrew is the mother tongue, it wasn't a problem reading it. They could figure it out fairly quickly. But with the Greek language, there's spaces between the words. There's uppercase letters and lowercase letters. And so to accommodate that, because you would use more space, it became more convenient to take the book of Kings and separate it into two books. That's basically the reason. It's out of convenience. Okay? So that helps us to understand a little bit more of what the place is for these books in our Bible. Of course, 1 Kings, what it does is it continues the narrative where 2 Samuel stops. Okay? We really don't have a gap between the last chapter of 1 Samuel and the first chapter of 1 Kings. Okay? So it just continues on with the narrative to help us understand what's going on. Let's talk about the date and the author as well. There apparently was only one author of the book of Kings. Okay? Or, as we would say, 1st and 2nd Kings, there was only basically one author. And as far as when it was written and the time period which it covers, we do a little bit of investigative journalism work to try and figure out where we would date these books. The latest item of 2 Kings that's recorded for us is the release of Jehoiachin. He was a king, okay? And he was released by Nebuchadnezzar later on. This is the latest item that we have in the history of these kings recorded for us in 2 Kings. So we know that took place around 562 BC, the release of Jehoiachin, okay? And since no mention is made of the return from Babylon, okay, remember Judah was taken into captivity in Babylon under King Nebuchadnezzar, okay? And when did they return from their captivity? We know it was 586 BC, okay? So that helps us with some timeline here, okay? So, 1st and 2nd Kings were probably written somewhere between 562 and 536, based on some of that investigation that we have, okay? Because no mention is talked about with regard to the return from exile, okay? And the latest item that we have, as far as history, is the release of Jehoiachin. That's how we come up with those dates. All that to say, we're talking a fairly broad time period, right? As to when these things were all taking place and when it would be written. Now, tradition has said this, and understand, look especially at this word. Tradition has assigned Jeremiah as the author of the book of Kings, 1st and 2nd Kings. Most authorities, okay, even though this is a traditional thought, we really have no evidence to confirm it. Okay, it's been a good, perhaps we could say a good rumor. Okay, most would say now, based on the evidence that we have, that we really cannot pinpoint who the author was. Jeremiah might be an interesting idea, and some would want to support that, but others would basically say this. Whether or not it was Jeremiah is not as important as at least coming to this point. The author of the book of Kings was most likely a Jewish captive from Babylon, okay? Writing while he was in captivity and helping to preserve the history of what happened in the kings with regard to both Judah and Israel. Jeremiah being the author, it's a nice thought, but we really don't have any evidence to back it up. Tradition would be that which would say Jeremiah was involved. So, with that in mind, let's go to the prominent subjects, okay, of 1 Kings. Of course, we have to deal with King Solomon. He basically, if we want to now get back into some of the things that the prophet Samuel said, remember when the Israelites were wanting a king, and they went to the prophet Samuel, who was their judge at that point, and said, yeah, we want a king like all of the other nations. Samuel wasn't all that impressed with that request, and as he consulted with God about it, God said to Samuel, basically, you know what? Don't worry about it. It isn't a case that they've rejected you. What they've done is rejected me. And so here's what I want you to do, Samuel. And what God does through Samuel is he tells the nation of Israel, okay, if you want a king, you will have a king. But understand what will happen when you have that king. And Samuel goes on to talk with Israelites about what they will have to endure with a king. They will have to endure things like a king setting up for himself and amassing all kinds of wealth, right? He will have all kinds of horses. He will have all kinds of women. And in order to sustain all of this, how is the king possibly going to sustain all of this? Well, he will sustain all of this by taxing the people, okay? Because he's got to gain revenue somehow to be able to amass all of these things. And so this is how he will do it. He will do it through the taxation of the people. Okay, so God said, you want a king? That's what you'll get. But understand, here are the parameters of what will go along with that. You can't have one and not the other. Solomon is basically the fulfillment of that. When you take a look at the reign of King Solomon, what do you find? Well, he was not only the wisest man of all of the kingdom and all of the surrounding kingdoms, so that was good, But he was also the wealthiest of all the kings. In fact, again, as some have tried to, and this is difficult at the best, but as some have tried to do, as they've tried to put Solomon's wealth in modern terms, in today's terms, Bill Gates wouldn't even be in competition with him. Okay, that's how wealthy Solomon was. As far as his armaments and his military prowess, he had all of the latest toys. Okay, he had horses and he had chariots and all the rest of those things. Okay, Solomon was head and shoulders above the rest with regard to his fame, his prosperity, his affluence, his wealth, and his influence. Of course, along with that influence, you have to be involved in political alliances. And in those days, what is the best way to create political alliances? You get together with the king's girl, okay? And so one of the reasons why Solomon had so many wives and concubines was because of these alliances that he would make with these surrounding nations and these surrounding kings. Now, not every one of them was because of an alliance. It seems that Solomon did have a weakness for the female persuasion, but we know that some of these were simply political alliances that he was making. But to have as many women as he did, estimates of 1,000, right, based upon the text, how do you keep them all happy, right? You who are involved in marriage relationships, you understand this, right? Just keeping each other happy sometimes can be a challenge, right? Imagine trying to do that now with 1,000 other people, okay? And spending time and all the rest of it. Well, we would say that this is all part of Solomon's downfall. But this was King Solomon. And he was basically the one who fulfilled what God said would happen, as they would have a king. What's also interesting about this King Solomon, too, being the son of David, was, again, let's remind ourselves whose son he was. Not only David's son, but also who was Solomon's mom, Bathsheba, the one whom David fell with, right? And so we see how God continues to use, right, the tragedies of human consequences and human decisions will still continue to have his plan move forward. And Solomon, with the great influence that he had, was one that God used, but would also be the one that would bring about the downfall of the kingdom. Especially when we get into Solomon's last years, and 1 Kings covers it for us, is where we begin to see the downward trend in fame and wisdom, in riches and honor, in position and popularity. Again, Solomon exceeded all of the kings of the earth. There was no one that could touch him in all of those things. But what happened was that these things won his heart. And what he did was he forgot the Lord. Remember what made David distinct from Saul? David was a man after God's own heart. What was distinctive between David and Solomon was that Solomon began with the desire of God, but did not end with the desire of God. He ended with the desire of all of what he had. And these were the things that won his heart, and indeed, he forgot the Lord. So, with this going on, and then when we take a look at the last part of Solomon's life, basically we conclude it this way. It was a tragedy when you get down to it. It was a tragedy in the end, and it was irretrievable. You couldn't bring it back. And 1 Kings shares that with us. It's here where we then are introduced to the split of the kingdom. Prior to this, the kingdom was unified. The 12 tribes of Israel, the ones who had come into the promised land and God had promised, and God had enabled them to. These are the same 12 tribes that will now split from each other, even though they are one race of people. So, 1 Kings 12, as we've said before, it's a key chapter in the Old Testament. Why? Because it records the event which steered the course of God's people through the remainder of the Old Testament days. Understand, now that this kingdom is split, it will never be the same again. They will return from exile. Both Judah and Israel, they will return from exile. But still, The kingdom will never recoup the days that they experienced under the reign of David and under the reign of Solomon during his early years. The kingdom will never be the same. And they will continue even up to this day. The kingdom still struggles, right? When you consider the amount of territory in the Middle East that David and Solomon had under their control, and you take a look at the nation of Israel now, it's pale in comparison. Okay, it's only a tiny, tiny fraction of what the kingdom looked like under the reigns of David and Solomon. So, yeah, this will be the watershed moment, shall we say? This will be the corner that's turned that they will never return back to what they were ever again. And before the event of the kingdom split, there were occasions of hostility that were taking place, some civil wars, we would say, between the northern tribes and the southern tribes. And along with Solomon's excessive taxation of the people, it stirred up such discontent that shortly after his death, the 10 northern tribes revolted against the authority of Solomon's son Rehoboam and formed another kingdom. In fact, as we read it in 1 Kings, basically this is what happens. Solomon is now dead. Solomon's son Rehoboam takes over the throne. And Solomon's advisors come to Rehoboam and say, you know what? We saw the heavy load that your father put these people under with his excessive taxation. And here's our advice for you now that you've taken over the reins. Our advice would be this. Let's ease back on the excessive taxation. Let's begin to make some moves whereby we help the people rather than burden the people. And then some of Rehoboam's advisors, the ones that weren't the advisors for Solomon, his dad, Rehoboam's advisors come along and say, listen, here's what you need to do. These folks had it pretty easy under your dad. You need to tighten the screws, and you need to really help these people understand who's boss. And so what does Rehoboam do? He listens to his advisors and not his father's advisors, and he basically says to the people, you think you had it bad under dad? You ain't seen nothing yet. And so he decrees what it is that he will do. 10 tribes to the north say, fine, if that's how it's going to be, you can go on without us. We're no longer under you. And we're going to find our own king, and we are going to find our own capital, and we are going to form our own kingdom, and you will have no authority over us. And they left. Simple as that. They just left. And so, here's what takes place and what happens as the kingdom splits. It's interesting how, even in our own history, have we not found this happening from time to time, where people just get fed up and they revolt, right? And they go their own way. And here we see an example of that happening. Do you think when the kingdom split, it broke God's heart? I would think so. It most likely did break his heart. But it didn't thwart God's plan. Right? Nothing can thwart God's plan. And so even though we may fail in our own choices that we make, even though we may fail in the decisions that we confront, let us remember, even though we may break God's heart, we can never thwart his plan. And we will see as we continue throughout the Old Testament, we will see how God's plan continues in spite of what humanity does in their good choices and even in their bad choices. Of course, we can't go through, and here's a map that helps us to understand how this kingdom was divided. Here's Jerusalem, okay? And basically the border between the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom is just north of Jerusalem. 10 tribes reside, we call them Israel. 10 tribes reside here. The 2 tribes, which we call Judah, reside here. Jerusalem will remain in the kingdom of Judah. Okay? Israel will set up its own capital. And its capital will be Samaria. That should twig something for us. Who comes out of Samaria? An ethnic people that during Jesus' day are hated and despised by the Jews. The Samaritans. It will be the northern kingdom that will not keep the bloodline pure, and they will intermarry. And this is where, in this area, this is where the Samaritan sect comes from. And so, here's where we're introduced to where that begins and where that will take place. Okay? It will be the northern kingdoms that are taken captive first, and they will be taken off into Assyria, up into this area of the map. Judah will be taken into captive a number of years after Israel is taken into captive, and they will be taken off into Babylon, which is basically in this area here. Okay? But that's how basically those two kingdoms now are established. Samaria being the capital for Israel, Jerusalem being the capital for Judah. Okay? Now, as we continue to talk about the prominent subjects of 1 Kings, we can't forget Elijah. Remember, chapter 17 through 22, the last chapters, introduce us to this prophet. This prophet of God. His name is Elijah, and some of the grand things that he does. I have a picture, a depiction here of when he takes on the prophets of Baal. We would say probably Elijah's most famous escapade in what's recorded for us in his ministry, as is recorded for us in 1 Kings. And of course, he did more than that. We have the account of he and the widow of Zarephath, right? Remember that? And he goes into this place for this widow and her son. Basically, the mom is collecting the last few sticks so that she can cook some meal for her and her son, and the economy is so bad that basically all she has left is the oil in the jar and the meal in the other jar, and that will be their last meal, and they have no means whatsoever of being able to survive. And as she shares with Elijah, she basically says to Elijah, "This will be our last meal. What can I do for you?" And Elijah says, "This is what I want you to do. Cook for me a cake so that I may eat, and you'll see how God will provide." And that's where, and this is, I find this to be astounding. You're preparing the last meal for your son, and this prophet comes along and says, prepare the meal for me, and I'll show you what God can do. Well, all you've got enough of is to make a cake for him now. And what does she do? She does it. Well, for a long while, those jars never dry up. There's always meal and there's always oil.
Would she have known who Elijah is?
She had heard of him, but basically it's not until she sees the miracles of God through him that she affirms, yes, you are a prophet of God. Especially when her son dies. Remember? Her son died, and he took her son to the roof of the house, pleaded for God to have him have his life restored. His life is restored. He brings him down in his arms off the roof. And what does the widow of Zarephath say? Surely, surely you are the man of God. And so, yeah, she knows as he lives in her home just exactly who he is. Imagine not grocery shopping for the next number of years, right? but it also helps us to understand the economic desperateness that was taking place during this time as well, during the time of Elijah's ministry. It's the same prophet that after he confronts the 400 prophets of Baal, and after those 400 prophets are massacred, right, that Jezebel says, you know, if the sun rises tomorrow morning and you're not dead, then I failed. Okay, that's basically what Jezebel said. This is where Elijah takes off out of fear. And here's where God provides for him. This is also here where God shows himself to Elijah in an amazing way. Not in the tornado, not in the earthquake, right? Remember he was in that cave? And God says, what are you doing here, Elijah? Why are you here? He's so exhausted from ministry and what has happened that he is so depressed that he just wants to end it all. Okay? But how does God reveal himself to Elijah? That still small voice, remember? Right? All of the power that is emitted in the weather systems that were going by the mouth of that cave, and then what happens? God speaks to Elijah in a still small voice. Okay? This is the prophet we're talking about. And those chapters themselves, chapters 17 through 22, a great read to see the power of God through a man who is obedient to the call of God on his life. And Elijah, 1 Kings, that's the book where we are introduced to him. This is always an amazing account, an amazing story, and I don't know if you've ever been involved in trying to stage one of those. We did it in a summer camp experience one time where we were having a fire down on the beach, but where this particular camp is located, there was 144 steps that went from the beach up to the top where the camp was located. Okay, that cliff was lined with trees, and so we had rigged it up whereby we had a fella in a tree up at the top of the cliff, and we had piano wire going from the tree all the way down into the center of the fire. And he had a trusty roll of toilet paper on the piano wire, and at the signal, he lit it, and all the kids saw, because it was dark, all the kids saw was this ball of flame coming out of nowhere into the center of the fire, and lit it, and we told about Elijah and the power of God working through him, and it was one of those moments that we were able to pull off. Chapter 17 through 22, a great read to see the power of God working through a person who is obedient to him. Especially, and here's what's another thing remarkable about Elijah. He is doing this ministry at the lowest part of the history of Israel. They're a divided kingdom. Things are not going well. Things are not going well at all. People are turning from God, turning to idols. All kinds of things going on that they would never have dreamed that they as the people of God would ever do. Elijah ministers during this time, and ministers with faithfulness. But, let's ask that question, as we always do, at the end of each book that we highlight in a review. So what? What about 1 Kings is applicable to me? What is in there for me? Well, we can say this, that 1 Kings has many spiritual applications in our lives. And it's just a case of taking the time, again, of sitting down and beginning to read through the 22 chapters of this book to be able to begin to see how the spiritual applications that we find in this book can apply to our lives. For example, this book is full of prayers, it's full of warnings, and it's full of exhortations. And what that does for us is you read the prayers, as you read the warnings, as you read the exhortations, is it encourages us in our continued obedience, or the need for our continued obedience to follow after God, even when things aren't going well, right? When things aren't going well, we have the tendency, right, to retreat and to forget about, this obviously isn't working, so I need to find something else. Isn't that the temptation? Okay? Well, these prayers, these warnings, these exhortations are good reminders for us. Stick at it. Keep at it. Keep moving forward. You know what God wants of you, so you keep doing that. Maybe nobody else understands, and maybe nobody else cares, but that's fine. You continue being the type of person that you need to be. Right? And when you read some of the prayers that these ones have, Solomon's prayer, for example, when he dedicates the temple to God after it's completed, a great prayer to read through and see the relationship that Solomon and God had and the desires that they had together. that need to be and should be some of the same desires that we would have. Okay, so these prayers, these warnings, these exhortations that we find in the book of 1 Kings are ones for our benefit as well. We again see in 1 Kings the Lord's justice and righteousness. We see his judgments and the fact that he will not be mocked. When he says this is the way in which you need to go, and if you do not go in this way, here are the consequences that will take place. We find this happening in 1 Kings. We also find God in his justice and his righteousness, especially when we begin to see the split kingdom and the different kings that are coming into these kingdoms, and some of the things that they do, some of the things that they don't do, and how God responds to them. And the prophets that he sends to continue to remind the people, wait a minute, whose people are you? Right? And we see some of these things as we go through 1 Kings. We also see the Lord's mercy countless times through this book. We see God's mercy. Why doesn't God just take Jezebel and Ahab and just get rid of them, right? They were the bane of the existence of the people for way too long. Well, we see again the Lord's mercy. In fact, toward the end of Ahab's reign, Ahab could have, and God said he would snuff him out. And then Ahab humbled himself. And so God said, well, this is what I will do then. And we see God's mercy even in the life of a king that did not want anything to do with God until he was cornered. And that's when he turned to God. Worship and praise is something else that we find in this book that encourages us. If you want to find out what a worship service was like during the days of King Solomon, then read 1 Kings. It will perhaps shatter some of your preconceived ideas of what a worship service was, and it will help you to understand the freedom that the people had and King Solomon had with regard to their worship and praise, and how long it would go on for. Nobody was watching the clock in those days, and especially when the temple was dedicated, and when God came in and dwelt in the temple, when the Shekinah glory came to the temple, and just the opportunity that they had to worship and enjoy God as they dedicated the temple. Here's a great source for us to understand what worship is. Okay, and so 1 Kings is a way to see that. The voice of God. We've often been curious about the voice of God, haven't we? Some of us would have claimed to have heard the voice of God, I'm sure. And some of us perhaps have some preconceived ideas as to what the voice of God would sound like. Some have a preconceived idea that the voice of God is that which is loud and not being able to be understood, something to be feared. And there were times when the voice of God was, where the people feared and feared terribly. For example, back in Exodus, when the people came and gathered at Mount Sinai, and God spoke with Moses, and the people were in literal fear, paralyzed fear, because of the voice of God being so loud. But here we find the voice of God in this book as one that is different, perhaps, from what we've seen in the previous books. Here's where we see God speaking quietly. Unobtrusive, not disruptive, but simply quiet and convincing. We especially again see that with Elijah's ministry. Especially when Elijah is in the desperate situation that he is in, where he's running for his life, and he runs so hard and so fast that he literally exhausts himself, and he collapses and falls asleep in the cave, right? God has to wake him to feed him. God has to wake him in order to nourish him again with the water of the brook that he was laying beside. And during all that time, what do we find? Again, the mercy of God. He doesn't scold Elijah. He doesn't scold Elijah for saying, why were you so afraid of Jezebel? After you had the great victory that you had through my power. Why are you so afraid of Jezebel? Notice that God never scolds Elijah for that. In fact, even as Elijah says, we might as well just end it all now. I'm worthless. I'm the only one that's following you. Let's just end it all now, God. And God doesn't scold him. But it's through the still small voice that God communicates with Elijah. That's where Elijah's attention is attained. And so we see God and his speaking with his people and with his faithful people in a tender way, in a way that's not condemning, but encouraging and strengthening. Successful leadership. We see some examples of that here too. I mean, again, we know how Solomon's reign ended. But during the beginning of his reign, we see the successes of Solomon and how, as he continues in his relationship with God, he continues in his success as a leader. It's when he forgets God that his abilities in leadership are questioned. In fact, brought to an end. Here's where we see a direct connection between those who would have successful leadership and the necessity of an intimate relationship with God. Successful leadership not in the world's eyes. That's not what we're talking about. Successful leadership in God's eyes. Remember, God said to Solomon, since you did not ask for riches, and since you did not ask for power, but you asked for wisdom, therefore I will supply all of those for you. Okay? And the necessity of an intimate relationship with God if we want to see leadership on the successful side. We also see here the hand of God in the experiences of individuals, but not just of individuals, but of entire nations as well. We see how God is involved in them both. We see it because we have it preserved for us on the written page. Unfortunately, as we read the accounts of what's preserved for us, many of the individuals and even the nations themselves at times doubted the existence of God, let alone his power. And they did not understand. But what the writer of 1 Kings does for us is he helps us to get a glimpse behind the scenes where we see how God responds to this, and we see how God is intimately involved, and we see how God works out his plan regardless of the choices that the nations make, regardless of the choices that the individuals make. We see God continuing his work. We get the behind-the-scenes view that the people didn't. But it reminds us again, God never is one that just leaves us to our own devices. At times he'll give us a lot of leash, but he never lets go of the leash. He never lets go of the leash. And 1 Kings reminds us of that as we see him involved in the lives of individuals and in the lives of the nations. Well, there's 1 Kings in all its glory. And let me encourage you to take some time to read through that. And as we've hit the highlights and as we've skimmed across the top of the service and kind of got a bit of an interest, a look into the content of the book, now as you would take time to read it, you'll be able to see some of these things that we've talked about. When we get together next, that's when we will go into the second book of the Kings. And we will see further history of this nation and what will take place as we continue to understand the Old Testament. So let's pray. Again, Father, we thank you for today and the opportunity to look into your word again. Father, even though we just skim the top of the book, we don't get into the details. We just kind of get an idea of what the content is about. It reminds us again of the things that not only you taught the people then, but that you wanted, the things that you want to teach us now. So, Father, encourage us as we would read this book. Help us to understand it even better, and encourage us in our faith walks with you as we continue reading your word. We pray it in Jesus' name. Amen.